The red MAGA hat turned the purchase into a scandal. Cashier cut the card, crowd recorded, and the customer turned out to be the store chain's owner. What happened next changed everything. In a quiet corner of a bustling city, the day at an electronics store started like any other. Samir, a humble immigrant, prided himself on being the perfect employee. He meticulously arranged merchandise on shelves, discreetly adjusted price tags, and greeted every customer with a polite nod. His colleagues knew. If there was a difficult customer, Samir was the go-to guy. His kindness could melt even the iciest hearts. But everything changed when he walked in. The center of attention was George, a man in his mid-40s with a commanding presence and confidence radiating from every step. On his head sat a bright red cap emblazoned with the words, "Make America Great Again." The cap seemed to shine on its own, as though a spotlight singled it out in the otherwise gray store. George approached Samir, seeking assistance in choosing a TV. "Hey, buddy, you work here, right?" he began, glancing at Samir's name tag. Samir looked up with a smile. "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" "First, tell me if you've got anything truly American here, not all this cheap Chinese junk," George said, leaning over the counter. Samir nodded politely and started explaining the differences between models. But George wasn't interested. His gaze wandered over Samir, then suddenly lingered. "You're new around here, aren't you?" he asked with a smirk. Samir paused. "I've lived in this city for 7 years, sir," he replied softly, trying to ignore the tone. 7 years? George laughed. "And you still talk with an accent? Huh, I thought you people adapted faster." The air in the store grew heavier. A few customers slowed down, drawn by the unfolding scene. Samir swallowed hard, determined to keep his composure. "I speak clearly enough to assist you, sir. Have you decided on a model?" But George seemed to revel in the attention he was getting. "Listen, I just want to know, what's it like being in a country where you get jobs while real Americans can't find them? Comfortable?" Several people in line gasped. A colleague of Samir's froze behind the register, visibly debating whether to intervene. Samir exhaled and, maintaining his calm, said, "It's comfortable, sir, especially when you work hard and try to help people, no matter their opinions." His response elicited quiet chuckles from nearby customers. George scowled, his confidence faltering. "Fine, kid. Just show me what you've got. But remember, I pay taxes so people like you can work here. Got it?" The customers, holding their breath, watched the exchange. Samir tilted his head slightly and gestured toward the TV display. In the silence, someone whispered, "My God, what a circus!" The scene culminated with George pulling out his credit card and tossing it onto the counter with a smirk. "And make it quick, got it? I don't have all day." Samir glanced at the card, noticing a slight crack on its edge. Looking back at George, a spark of resolve flashed in his eyes. "Of course, sir," he said with a faint smile, picking up a pair of scissors. The crowd, many now recording the encounter on their phones, froze, unaware of the twist to come. When George finally chose a TV, he marched confidently to the register, with Samir following closely behind, masking how difficult it was to stay composed. The crowd parted like theatergoers awaiting the next act. George dumped the box on the counter as if he'd won a war. "Let's hurry this up. I don't have all day," he declared, pulling out his wallet, his smug smile unrelenting. Without looking, he flicked his credit card onto the counter. The card wobbled slightly, as though it too hesitated to participate in this drama. Samir examined the card. One corner was chipped, and a thin crack ran across its surface. His gaze lifted to George, who was already opening his mouth for another snide remark. But Samir spoke first. "Excuse me, sir," he began politely, holding the card between his fingers. "It looks like this card is damaged. It might not be safe for transactions." George smirked, leaning closer. "Oh, don't give me that nonsense. Just swipe it, will ya? Or is that above your skill level?" Keeping his composure, Samir turned the card to show George the crack. "I'd recommend replacing it, sir. Your bank can—" "Don't tell me how my card works," George interrupted, raising his voice. The crowd started murmuring. At that moment, an impulse struck Samir. He glanced at the scissors lying on the counter, then back at the card. A split-second decision formed in his mind, a move that would end the situation decisively. He picked up the scissors, gripping them firmly. Without a word, he cut the card in half. The sharp crack of plastic echoed in the store's silence. George froze. His expression shifted from shock to fury as his face turned crimson. "What the hell are you doing? Do you know who I am?" Samir calmly placed the two halves of the card on the counter and met George's gaze directly. "Sir, the store reserves the right to refuse service if a customer behaves inappropriately. Your insults and conduct—" "Conduct?" George interrupted, his voice booming across the store. "You're lecturing me about conduct? I demand the manager, right now." The crowd stirred. More people pulled out their phones to record. Someone whispered to a friend, "This is better than primetime TV." But Samir didn't flinch. "Of course, sir. I'll call the manager," he replied, stepping aside and signaling to a colleague. George, however, wasn't done. His voice grew louder. "You think you can treat me like this? I pay for all this," he exclaimed, gesturing wildly around the store. "Do you even know who you're dealing with?" From the crowd, someone muttered sarcastically, "Yeah, a guy with an overinflated ego." The remark drew quiet laughter. George whipped around, glaring, before focusing back on Samir. "You'll lose your job for this, you hear me? Fired, gone." Samir smiled faintly. "I'm just doing my job, sir." At that moment, the store manager, Clara, a woman in her mid-40s, approached. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene. An irate customer, a calm employee, and dozens of cameras documenting every second. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice firm but composed. George turned to her like a drowning man grasping a lifeline. This guy refused to serve me and cut my card in half. Fire him immediately." Clara glanced at the halved card, then at Samir, who calmly explained the situation. "I followed protocol and aimed to protect the store's reputation," he said. The crowd held its breath, waiting for her response. Clara paused, taking in the room, then said, "We'll investigate, sir, but please remain calm." George, sensing the crowd wasn't on his side, unleashed one last tirade. "Calm? You'll regret this. I'll make sure this store regrets ever letting me in." The crowd erupted into sarcastic applause. One customer shouted, "Great show! When's the next act?" The chapter ends with George, red-faced and fuming, demanding to escalate the matter. Samir, composed and dignified, stands his ground, knowing justice is on his side. Meanwhile, customers speculate how this drama will soon go viral. The store fell silent as George straightened up, pointing an accusatory finger at Samir and declaring loudly, "I am the CEO of the company that owns this chain of stores, and I assure you, this guy will no longer be working here." His words hung in the air like an unexpected thunderclap. Customers exchanged glances, some whispering in disbelief. "Is this guy serious, or is he pulling our leg?" someone muttered in the back. Samir, standing behind the counter, felt his spine tense. His eyes met Clara's, the manager, who looked caught off guard. "I think we can resolve this without making a scene, sir," Clara began, trying to sound composed, though a faint tremble in her voice betrayed her. "Without a scene?" George roared, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling corporate right now. This immigrant—" The crowd buzzed with discontent. Someone closer to the front recorded the outburst, while murmurs of disapproval rippled through the group. Despite the revelation of George's status, Samir maintained his composure. He exhaled quietly and met George's fiery gaze with a calm, firm tone. "Sir, you're welcome to call whoever you like, but rules are rules, and they apply to everyone equally." George's eyes narrowed as his face reddened further. "You've just made the biggest mistake of your life, kid." He dialed a number and began speaking loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "Yes, this is George Hunt. I need someone from HR on the line immediately. I've got an employee here who thought it was okay to cut up my credit card. Yes, I'm serious. Fire him, right now." Clara attempted to interject. "Sir, perhaps we could—" "I didn't ask for your opinion, miss," George snapped, waving her off as if dismissing an underling. Meanwhile, Samir stood his ground, fully aware that his future hung by a thread. He took a step forward, raising his hand slightly to address the room. "If I may," he began, his voice steady but audible enough to carry through the hushed store, "I'd like to explain why I acted the way I did." George glared daggers at him, but didn't interrupt, seemingly savoring what he thought was Samir's impending downfall. "Every day," Samir continued, "people like me come to work to do our best. We aim to be polite, patient, and helpful, even when we're faced with hostility. We hear comments and jokes that have nothing to do with our job, and I thought I'd gotten used to it. But today—" He paused, glancing briefly at George before continuing. His voice shook slightly, but it only made his words more heartfelt. "Today, I realized that staying silent isn't always the answer. No one deserves to be insulted for who they are. Not even someone like me, an immigrant, as you said." A heavy silence filled the room. Several customers nodded in agreement, and one woman in the line clapped softly. The applause spread until a few others joined in. George scowled, looking around as if the crowd's response confused him. "What, you're all on his side?" he bellowed, gesturing angrily toward the group. "Yes," someone called out from the back. "Because he's right." Samir took another breath, regaining his calm demeanor. "I'm not trying to argue with you, sir. You can fire me if you want, but I stand by my actions because respect isn't something you can buy with a credit card." The crowd erupted into louder applause, and scattered voices shouted their approval. "Good job!" "Well said!" George's face turned as red as his cap. He opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the cheers and clapping. Clara, emboldened by the crowd's reaction, stepped forward with a faint smirk. "Mr. Hunt, perhaps it's time for everyone to cool off a bit." George shot her an angry glare. "Cool off? This isn't over," he barked, before storming out of the store, his phone clutched tightly in his hand. The customers burst into sarcastic applause as he left. One man shouted, "Bravo! When's the next act?" Samir stood quietly at the counter, maintaining his composure, though a faint smile played on his lips. Around him, customers began discussing the scene, many vowing to share the video they had just captured. As the store slowly returned to its normal buzz, Clara turned to Samir and said softly, "You handled that well. Don't worry, we've got your back." The chapter ends with Samir standing tall, confident that the truth and his integrity would prevail. The customers, buzzing with excitement, knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, and something bound to go viral. Hours after the morning incident, the electronics store was abuzz with an unusual energy. A group of people in sharp suits appeared at the entrance, immediately catching the attention of employees and customers alike. This was a delegation from the corporate headquarters. Their faces showed a mix of irritation and caution. Clara, the store manager, quickly approached them. "Good afternoon. How can I help you?" she asked with polite professionalism. One of the men, seemingly the leader, introduced himself briskly. "Robert Gray, Director of Human Resources. We need to speak with your employee Samir immediately regarding this morning's incident." Clara tensed slightly, but nodded and led the delegation to the register, where Samir continued working as if nothing had happened. He already sensed that something significant was about to unfold, but maintained his composure. "Samir, these are representatives from corporate," Clara said quietly. Samir nodded, wiping his hands on his apron. "Good afternoon. How can I assist you?" Robert studied him for a moment before speaking. "We're aware of the incident this morning. The video of your exchange with Mr. Hunt has gone viral. The corporate office has received hundreds of messages from customers and, let's just say not all of them are in support of Mr. Hunt." Samir froze momentarily, then noticed a few customers behind him smiling and nodding approvingly. "A video?" he asked. "Yes," another representative interjected, holding up a phone. "Based on the comments, people are impressed with how you handled yourself. To put it mildly, they are not happy with Mr. Hunt's behavior." At that moment, the store's door opened, and George walked in. He looked far less confident than he had earlier. His face was grim, and the phone in his hand buzzed incessantly with incoming calls. "Robert," George began, ignoring Samir and the others. "I can explain. This was just a misunderstanding. That guy violated store policy, and—" "Enough, George," Robert interrupted, raising a hand. His tone was firm but calm. "We've seen everything. Your actions today have caused significant damage to the company's reputation." "Damage?" George exclaimed, his composure unraveling. "I was protecting our brand from this." He gestured toward Samir, but Robert didn't let him finish. "No, George, you acted with bias and aggression. We value every customer and every employee, regardless of their background, appearance, or beliefs. Your behavior is unacceptable." The crowd of customers began murmuring again, and someone even clapped. George glanced around, realizing he was vastly outnumbered. "You can't do this!" he shouted, his voice rising. "I can and I will," Robert said firmly. "You are temporarily suspended from your position pending an internal investigation." George stood frozen, his face a mix of anger and humiliation. He turned abruptly and stormed out of the store, to the sound of sarcastic applause from the customers. Robert turned back to Samir. "We understand that you were put in a difficult situation, and we'd like to apologize on behalf of the company for Mr. Hunt's behavior. Additionally, corporate has decided to offer you a promotion. Would you accept?" Samir looked at Robert in surprise, then at Clara, who smiled and nodded. "I'm grateful for the opportunity," he said, maintaining his calm demeanor. Robert extended his hand, and Samir shook it firmly. "You've shown that even in challenging moments, you can maintain dignity. That's something we value highly." As the delegation left, the crowd of customers erupted into applause. Some shouted, "Way to go, Samir! Keep it up!" Samir, smiling, picked up a sign from the counter that read, "We work for you," and ceremoniously removed it. "Today I've learned," he said, addressing the crowd, "that doing the right thing is always the best strategy." The applause grew louder, and someone even suggested taking a selfie with the hero of the day. Samir, for the first time in what felt like ages, truly felt that justice and truth had triumphed.